This St Patrick's Day, people across the world are celebrating their Irish heritage, especially in the United States, where the rivers turn green. But did you know that more than 20 million Americans today have Scots-Irish or Ulster Scots ancestry? The group profoundly shaped US history, influencing its politics, its culture and frontier expansion.
Yeah, several famous figures, of course, such as Dolly Parton and Elvis have spoken of their family ties. But also in Washington, there are big name politicians who have talked about their links, including the Vice President, J.D. Vance, and the US Secretary of State, Mark Rubio, and they are championing that connection.
Our frontiers were shaped by Scots-Irish, that proud, hardy clan from the hills of Ulster that gave us Davy Crockett and Mark Twain and Teddy Roosevelt and Neil Armstrong.
With the US preparing to mark 250 years since the Declaration of Independence in 2026, there's renewed interest in the people who shaped the Ulster Scots spirit. And with us is Mark Logan, who is former MP for Bolton North East, but he has roots in Northern Ireland and has been examining why the Ulster Scots story is resonating again in the United States. Really interesting to be talking to you, Mark, especially on the day that's in it. You've talked before about the Ulster Scots story. Do you sense a real shift kind of in the power balance, I guess, between the old Irish American power, particularly politically, and Ulster Scots power?
Well, I think, going back historically, obviously the Scots-Irish or Ulster Scots, as we call them back here, have had a massive impact on the United States political system, especially from the first non-establishment president that they had in Andrew Jackson in the 19th century. But when you come right up to today, after some would say maybe 13, 17 or whatever US presidents with Ulster Scots heritage, we can actually see, as you've just referred to, Sarah, we see a bit of a change in the dynamic where I suppose the kind of green of St Patrick's Day and the Irish American diaspora still massive influence in US politics, but there has been this reascendancy in the Scots-Irish, and if anything it's sort of centred on that holy trinity of Donald Trump, the president, and in his Oval Office there is indeed a portrait of Andrew Jackson. There may also be a Chester Arthur portrait, but I can't quite work out from some of the visuals sometimes, who of course has roots in Callybackie in County Antrim, and then Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, and J.D. Vance, as you referred to. So this is a great time to be promoting the relationships between Northern Ireland, between Ulster and the US, whether it's culturally, politically, or indeed economically.
Yeah, just on that, I mean, when Marco Rubio stood up at the Munich Security Conference and told the assembled dignitaries that America's frontiers were shaped by the Scots-Irish, and talked about that proud, hearty clan from the hills of Ulster, and talked about Mark Twain and Teddy Roosevelt and all of that. Were you surprised by that, by him front and centre stating his heritage?
I suppose where the surprise comes from, when you think about it, in Northern Ireland itself, right, we have a population of 1.8, 1.9 million, of which those who would refer to themselves as Ulster Scots, maybe a million or less, and those with very thick kind of Ulster Scots accents, maybe even less, maybe you're coming down to the number of a couple of 100 or 300,000 people. But I think because of that, that's where the surprise comes from. When you hear someone from the world's superpower on the stage at the most important security conference on the calendar every year, referring to our own people, the Ulster Scots, to the Scots-Irish, that is definitely punching above our weight. So it's a huge surprise, but it also does show you how important it is for those in the United States culturally and indeed politically to hark back to their own story, that story of individualism, the story of adventurism, and maybe a stubbornness, if you would have, or thranness, as we talk about right back home. And I think that there's more and more people in the US are interested in actually channeling that energy, and we should definitely make as much hay with that as we can. Yeah,
I mean, Joe Biden obviously really massively interested in his Irish ancestry and heritage, and came over here and had the big visit, and it was a huge deal, but it did spark an enormous amount of debate about whether or not that level of influence, the Irish American influence that was once all powerful in America, is now very, very much on the wane. And when you see, I guess, our political representation this time round, and you hear about this tightrope that Micheál Martin is having to walk, what do you think about the state of play there now?
Well, I still think, obviously, the Irish influence is massive culturally, politically, diplomatically. As I often talked about, whether it was looking at Irish diplomacy in the EU or Irish diplomacy in America, oftentimes a country, if you say the Republic of Ireland of 5 to 6 million people, were running rings around a country of 60 million people in the case of the United Kingdom, or 68 million people. So you can kind of see that there is that huge influence, but there is a change. I mean, politically, if you look at, I suppose, in the case of south of the border, there's definitely a very clear sentiment on, say, for example, issues in the Middle East, on Palestine, on Gaza. In Northern Ireland, it's not as clear cut. It still tends to fall down these ethnic kind of lines of where you stand on such an issue. And perhaps that gives us a little bit more flexibility, a little bit more nuance when it comes to interacting with the US. And we shouldn't say, oh, this is the end of Irish influence, full stop, because as we know, politics, and more so today than ever, is very transient and it's ever changing, and who knows what comes after this Trump presidency. But I think we have to put ourselves in as good a stead as possible. We've got our Ulster Scots agency in Belfast and Donegal. We've got a new commissioner for the Ulster Scots, and we should be trying to push as hard as we can to build the ties across the Atlantic so that we don't just benefit in this current Trump administration, but if J.D. Vance comes next, if Marco Rubio comes next, or if someone on the Democratic side comes next, that we can actually do well out of this from Belfast.
Yeah, you're very close to Cullybackey in terms of your roots as well, aren't you? You should just say big shout out for Cullybackey there and Chester Alan Arthur's ancestral home. That's where your family are from originally. Is that where you grew up?
That's exactly it. So I often said 3 fields across, but I think it was maybe slightly exaggerating. It's about a 3-minute drive to the Chester Arthur cottage. And I was there just a few weeks ago on my last trip back home, and I couldn't get over how fantastic the wee cottage is. My whole life I'd lived in that area, but I'd never got to visit the cottage because it was always very difficult to book in. You had to book months in advance way back in the 90s and 00s. But anyone who's interested in history and politics and local history should visit. It's a wonderful, wonderful little museum and cottage in Cullybackey.
Yeah, should mention Chester A. Arthur was the 21st President of the United States. Thanks so much for talking to us on the programme today, Mark. Really interesting to have your thoughts. Mark Logan, former MP for Bolton North East.
The way they're talking, it's also Marco Rubio's decided he's kind of like almost putting aside his Cuban roots and deciding, oh no, I'll embrace Ulster Scots too. I'll go that way.
We can
Irish
be both,
Scots, whatever.
I guess.
Well, he can be everything, judging by things. Although sometimes I think you need to be everything inside the Trump White House. But that's another story. It is 8:31.